July 1874. The long blue line of Custer's Black Hills expedition wound through the pine-covered ridges like a slow-moving serpent of dust, steel, and horseflesh. Lieutenant Elias Grant, 29 years old and still carrying the ghosts of Antietam and Gettysburg, rode near the head of the column. His faded Union blue uniform was streaked with trail grime, and his orders felt heavier every mile they pushed deeper into land the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had promised would belong to the Lakota forever. Grant had seen enough broken promises in his life to know this one would not last, but he kept his mouth shut. He was here to map, survey, and protect, or so the official documents claimed. Custer himself rode ahead on his favorite horse, golden hair streaming, eyes bright with the promise of glory and perhaps something more valuable. Among the civilian scouts and wranglers was Jonah Rivers, a tall, powerfully built black man in his late 30s. Born into slavery on a Texas cotton plantation, Jonah had walked away free in 1865 with nothing but a saddle and the clothes on his back. He had spent the next decade learning the cattle trails, becoming one of the best ropers and horse handlers on the southern plains. White ranchers paid him half wages at best, so when the army offered steady pay to wrangle remounts for the expedition, Jonah signed on. He could calm a stampeding herd with a low whistle and read the land like a book. One blistering afternoon beside French Creek, while the column watered the horses, Jonah knelt in the shallow riffles. His dark fingers sifted through the cold gravel, and there it was, bright yellow flecks that flashed like tiny suns. He slipped a few into his pocket, and later showed them privately to Lieutenant Grant beside a crackling cook fire. "Lieutenant, this ain't just color," Jonah said in his deep, steady voice. "This is the kind that turns men into devils. Enough to start a war." Grant turned the nuggets in his palm, the firelight dancing across his face. "Keep it quiet, Jonah. This land is Lakota. The treaty." "Treaties get broken every day, sir," Jonah answered quietly. "But this gold will break more than paper. I can feel it." Unseen on a high ridge 2 miles away, a Lakota holy man named Two Eagle had been watching the Bluecoats for days. Two Eagle, a respected Wicassawakan of the Oglala Band, wore a simple buckskin shirt and carried a sacred pipe bag. From his vantage, he saw the soldiers laughing, panning, and filling pouches with the yellow metal. That night he sat with the Cheyenne dog, Soldier Broken Arrow, a scarred warrior whose face was painted with lightning bolts and whose lance bore eagle feathers. Two Eagle's voice was low and heavy with sorrow. "The white man has pierced the heart of the world," he said. "Pahasapa bleeds. The spirits weep blood. The yellow metal they dig will bring a flood of death upon us all. We must warn our people before the flood becomes a river of fire." Broken Arrow gripped his lance until his knuckles whitened. "Words will not stop them. Only blood and fire ever have." News of the discovery could not be contained. Frank "Whiskey" Dolan, a jittery Union Army deserter posing as a civilian teamster, wrote a hasty letter to an old friend in Cheyenne City. Dolan had deserted 2 years earlier after watching too many friends die for causes he no longer believed in. Now he drove supply wagons and drowned his nightmares in cheap whiskey. He slipped the letter into a mail pouch bound for the East. Within weeks, newspapers back in Chicago and New York printed wild exaggerations. A new El Dorado in Sioux country. Illegal prospectors began slipping across the treaty line in small, desperate groups, ignoring the Army's half-hearted warnings. Lieutenant Grant sat by his lantern that night, writing in his journal, "We have opened a door that cannot be closed. God help us all if the gold fever takes hold." Jonah Rivers lay awake under the stars, staring into the blackness, wondering if the glittering specks he had found would curse the sacred hills forever. Far to the north, Two Eagle and Broken Arrow rode back toward their camps under moonlight, carrying a warning that would echo across the plains like distant thunder. The Black Hills had been violated, and nothing would ever be the same. Fall 1875. By the time the aspens turned gold and the nights grew sharp with frost, The trickle of prospectors had become a roaring flood. Hundreds of men, dreamers, failures, and fugitives, poured into the narrow, shadowed valley the Lakota had long called the place of dead trees. Deadwood Gulch earned its name quickly. The creek ran black with silt, the banks were choked with fallen pine skeletons, and the air hung thick with smoke, sweat, and the metallic tang of turned earth. Jonah Rivers arrived driving a small herd of gaunt Texas longhorns he hoped to sell at premium prices to the hungry miners. What greeted him was pure bedlam. Claim stakes bristled from every flat patch of ground like a forest of sticks. Canvas tents flapped in the cold wind, rough log cabins rose overnight, and the first crude saloons already echoed with drunken shouts and the tinny plink of pianos. Clara Donnelly had beaten most of them to the best spot. A sturdy widow from Missouri who had buried her husband to cholera on the trail west, Clara had driven her own wagon across the plains with nothing but grit and a shotgun. She pitched a large canvas tent beside the creek and hung a hand-painted sign, Donnelly's Rest, whiskey, beans, and a clean bed. Within weeks, her establishment was the busiest in the gulch. Miners crowded the rough plank bar, laughing too loud, fighting too quick. Clara ran it with iron resolve and a double-barreled shotgun she kept loaded under her apron. She protected her two working girls like daughters and turned away troublemakers with a sharp tongue and a colder stare. "This is my place," she would say, "and in my place you behave or you leave." Frank "Whiskey" Dolan rolled in one drizzly October afternoon driving a freight wagon loaded with picks, powder, and barrels of rye. He recognized Jonah from the Custer expedition and gave him a wary nod across the muddy street. Dolan kept his army desertion secret, but his hands still trembled at sudden loud noises. One cold evening, after selling his load, he confided in Jonah over a tin cup of Clara's whiskey. "I can't run forever, Jonah. The army's still looking for men like me." Jonah only nodded. He understood running better than most. From the ridgeline above the gulch, Two Eagle and Broken Arrow watched in silence. The holy man's eyes glistened with quiet rage as he saw white men tearing at the earth with shovels and sluices. "This is how the world ends," Two Eagle whispered. The next morning, miners woke to find painted arrows driven into the ground near their claims. Not an attack, but a warning. Lieutenant Grant, now stationed at the makeshift Camp Crook a day's ride away, received frantic reports of hostile sightings. He rode into Deadwood Gulch himself and found Jonah Rivers helping Clara unload heavy barrels. Grant pulled the black cowboy aside near the creek. "You started this," Grant said, voice tight. "That gold you showed me on French Creek." Jonah looked at the muddy street where two miners were already fist-fighting over a single claim stake. "I didn't start greed, Lieutenant. I just found the color. The rest is on men's souls." Clara listened from the tent flap and said nothing, but that night she saved the last hot meal for Jonah and pressed a cup of coffee into his hands. "This gulch is going to eat itself alive," she told him quietly, "and when it does, someone's going to have to decide which side they're on." Broken Arrow's band grew bolder, raiding supply trains at night. No one died yet, but the message was unmistakable. The Black Hills still belonged to the Lakota and Cheyenne. Jonah found himself walking a razor's edge, working for white miners by day, slipping food and quiet warnings to Two Eagle under cover of darkness. The gulch was rushing headlong toward something none of them could yet name. Spring 1876. By March 1876, the 7 rival mining camps, scattered along the narrow gulch, had merged into one raw, sprawling settlement. Deadwood was officially laid out on paper, crooked streets, false front buildings slapped together from green lumber, and a population that had already swollen past 3,000 souls. The air rang constantly with hammer blows, shouted curses, and the creak of wagon wheels. Jonah Rivers sold his last cattle for a decent price and took a job wrangling horses at the new livery stable. He watched the transformation with quiet unease. Clara Donnelly's canvas tent saloon had become a permanent 2-story log building, the first real structure in town, with a proper bar, a piano shipped all the way from St. Louis, and rooms upstairs for her girls. She hired a one-armed cook and kept order with the same iron will and loaded scattergun. Deadwood ain't a town yet, she liked to say, but it's sure trying to become one. Frank Dolan arrived on the spring stage with a fresh scar across his cheek from a road agent holdup. He confided in Jonah one quiet night over whiskey behind the livery. "I can't run forever, Jonah. The army's still hunting deserters, and this town is getting too big to hide in." Jonah only nodded. He understood the weight of secrets. Lieutenant Grant rode in with a small patrol, trying in vain to bring some semblance of order. He found two eagle waiting on the edge of town, unarmed, holding a white flag fashioned from a flour sack. Through Jonah as interpreter, the holy man spoke with quiet dignity. "Your people have broken every promise the paper ever held," two eagles said. "The gold will bring blood. Leave these hills or the spirits will take them back in fire and sorrow." Grant listened, then shook his head slowly. "The treaty is dead, old man. Congress has already taken the Black Hills. Go home before more of your young men die for nothing." Broken Arrow watched from the tree line, eyes burning. That night he and two warriors slipped down and burned an empty claim shack on the outskirts, the first real warning fire. No one was hurt, but the smoke rose high and the message spread like wildfire through the saloons. Miners immediately formed a vigilance committee. Clara Donnelly locked her doors early, loaded every weapon in the house, and told Jonah on the saloon steps, "This town was born in sin and greed. It'll die the same way unless someone stands up and says enough." In the weeks that followed, Deadwood grew louder, bloodier, and more lawless by the day. Jonah Rivers sat with Clara on the wooden steps of her new saloon one quiet April evening, watching Two Eagle and Broken Arrow ride away across the hills. Frank Dolan stood nearby, reins in hand, ready to drive the next stage out before the trouble truly began. Jonah spoke softly into the gathering dusk. "I wish we'd never found that gold on French Creek." Clara touched his shoulder with surprising gentleness. "We didn't find it, Jonah. It found us. Now we live with what it brings, or we die with it." Lieutenant Grant watched the same riders disappear from the far end of the street. He touched the faded letter in his pocket, the one that had started everything, and wondered if any of them would survive the summer that was coming fast. The Black Hills had awakened. Deadwood had been born in blood and gold. And the real story, the shootings, the fires, the broken promises, was only just beginning. The Black Hills were stolen. Deadwood was born in gold and broken promises. Two Eagles' warning still hangs in the air. Next time, Wild Bill Hickok rides in. The cards fall and the guns speak. The legend begins right here, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell.